Meanwhile, conferences were taking place in Paris between Prince Schwarzenberg and the Duc de Marais. They were limited on the part of the Austrian envoy to an abundance of friendly protestations, which lost in value on account of the manner in which they were lavished. In one of these conferences, however, the prince let slip a very significant statement. Apropos of obligations which seemed to be a natural consequence of a family alliance, Prince Schwarzenberg said, "Politics made the marriage, politics can unmake it." Although Monsieur de Bassenot did not acquaint the emperor with this remark, the reserve of the Austrian ambassador who formulated no declaration aroused the suspicion that he had a mental reservation that he was trying to gain time. In the end, however, came the proposal of an armed mediation, accompanied by a renewal of friendly protestations and the assurance that if Austria presented herself under arms, it was in order to force the Allies to make peace. Napoleon then decided to send Prince Eugene off to Italy, where he considered his presence would be more useful in case of a rupture. At the same time, he recalled Marshal Soult, whom he wished to employ in the great army from Spain. Whilst the emperor was in Dresden, the Austrian general Bubna was sent to him. It was always the same language that was held, but after a great deal of reticence, it was hinted that Austria's fidelity to the French alliance merited as a compensation on the part of France a renunciation of the protectorate of the Confederation of the Rhine, the dislocation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the restitution of Illyria to Austria. The said restitution not being the subject of any contestation, Monsieur de Bubna at the same time proposed that a general congress should be opened, declaring that Russia and Prussia admit Austria's mediation, but that he cannot explain what will be the nature of this mediation. Napoleon, losing all trust in the friendly dispositions affected towards him by Austria, but still dissembling, decided to send the Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt to Russian headquarters to come to an understanding with the Tsar on the basis of general pacification, preferring to deal with an open enemy rather than with a perfidious ally. The Emperor Alexander, who was already engaged to Austria, refused to receive Caulaincourt. In the meanwhile, the victories of Bautzen and Württemberg determined the Allies to propose an armistice, during which they added the mediating power would expose the basis of peace, the armed mediation having accordingly been denounced as disposed of. Napoleon once more agreed to this armistice and had reason to regret doing so thereafter. But he hoped to make use of his expression to get a better insight of the pieces on the chessboard, to find means, thanks to this truce, of approaching the Emperor Alexander and of making Austria pay the price for her bad faith, whilst I was fulfilling my functions in the Empress's service as secretary of her commands. This princess received one day the following letter from the Emperor. Madame and dear friend, I send you an open letter for the Duc de Trente, Fouché. You will send for the Duke and you will hand him this letter yourself. If he needs a passport, you will order one to be given to him. My desire being that this mission should remain secret. You may, however, speak of it to the Arch-Chancellor, my desire being that nothing be ever kept secret from him. But you will arrange that whilst the Arch-Chancellor is with you. The Duc de Trente shall have been already sent for and be present. Signed, Napoleon. Dresden, May 11th, 1813. In conformity with the request contained in this letter, which was handed to him, Fouché left for Dresden. Napoleon thought it prudent not to leave this individual in Paris under the grave circumstances in which France and the Empire were placed. The object of this letter was to remove Fouché from Paris and to send him to Illyria to replace General Bertrand, whose presence was more useful with the army. By a letter on the same day, the emperor commissioned the empress to send the Duc de Bassenot to Dresden also. But these two letters had been written with very different purposes. Since I have begun quoting letters written from Napoleon to Marie-Louise, I will copy two more. The first of which will show both the empress's ingenuousness and the emperor's extreme delicacy in all matters concerning the proprieties, and to what a pitch he carried his scruples in these matters. Madame and dear friend, I have received a letter in which you inform me that you received the Arch-Chancellor whilst you were in bed. My pleasure is that under no circumstances whatsoever and on no pretext you receive anybody whilst you are in bed, no matter who he may be. That is only permissible after 30 years of age. Signed, Napoleon. At Hanau, June 7th, 1813. Another letter from the Emperor. Madame and dear friend, I receive your letter of May 30th. I think that it is useless for you to go to Notre Dame for the Te Deum for the Battle of Vrtchen. It will be sufficient for you to go to the Tuileries and that the Te Deum be chanted with pomp in the chapel, there at the ordinary hour of the court, and that you hold a grand drawing room in the evening. I am writing this in the supposition that it has not been officially announced that you will go to Notre Dame. For, of course, if the program has appeared, it must not be countermanded, and there would be more inconvenience in not going than in going. Signed, Napoleon. Liegnitz, June 9th, 1813. In another of his letters to Marie-Louise, Napoleon reverts to the same subject. He tells the Empress that she did well to go to the Te Deum, which was chanted for the Battle of Lutzen, but that such ceremonies should not be too frequent, and that it is because they are rare that they are imposing. As a general rule, he adds, it is suitable that the Te Deum should be chanted on the Sunday following. It is a mistake to delay it. I do not see why Pentecost should prevent the singing of a Te Deum when an event has passed by or events happen, and that may give rise to all sorts of inconveniences. Have a grand theatrical performance in a large court at St. Cloud on that day. These letters arrived at the time when the program of the ceremony was published in the Moniteur. The Empress accordingly proceeded with great pomp to Notre Dame to conform with the orders which she had received. In the course of these glorious commencements of the 1813 campaign, the Emperor and the army had experienced two notable losses in reconnoitering expedition effected on the eve of the Battle of Lutzen. The Duc d'Istrie, Bessières, was struck by a bullet in the head and killed. Colonel of Napoleon's guides in the Army of Italy and afterwards commander of the Imperial Guard. Bessières had followed the emperor in all his campaigns. His bravery, his great experience in the cavalry branch, as much as his devotion to Napoleon's persons, had raised him to the rank of marshal. The grief occasioned to the emperor by Marshal Bessières' death was raised to the highest pitch by the death of the Duc de Friaul. Duroc, who, less fortunate than the former, survived for 12 hours a terrible wound which he received on the evening of the Battle of Vrtchen. The enemy's last cannonball sought him out far from the firing in the midst of a group where he was conversing with General Kirgener and Marshal Mortier. This ball opened the Grand Marshal's stomach, killed General Kirgener, and only grazed the Duke of Trevize. Napoleon was present at Duroc's last moments. He went to see him after the sentries had been placed at the house to which he had been transported and found him fully conscious. This interview was a most poignant one. Napoleon exchanged some words with the most regretted of his officers, in which Duroc expressed sentiments of the purest devotion, and the emperor his bitter regrets and the hope that they might meet again in another world. Napoleon, a prey to the most terrible emotion, remained more than a quarter of an hour grasping Duroc's right hand with his head resting upon it. The deep silence which reigned during this painful scene was broken by Duroc, who begged the emperor to go away from so sad a sight. And Napoleon, unable to speak, could say nothing to him but, "Farewell then, my friend." He thereupon withdrew, and leaning on Marshal Soult in the Grand Equerry, Caulaincourt, and went to shut himself up in his tent, where he spent the night alone weeping for his friend and reflecting the painful warnings which the genius which presided over his destiny seemed to be giving him. After his return from Mayence, where he went to spend some days with the Empress, Napoleon halted in the course of one of his marches before the house in the village where the Grand Marshal had died. He sent for the pastor and commissioned him to have a small monument raised in the interior of this modest abode in remembrance of the loss which he had experienced there. Napoleon wished the tenant of the house to become its owner, with the charge of preserving the monument in it, and ordered the amount of the purchase money as well as the sum of the mausoleum to be paid over at once. One might have said that Napoleon, who had been so long favored by fortune, brought evil fortune to all his people. On the morrow of Duroc's death, Colonel Bernard, one of the emperor's aides-de-camp, broke his leg whilst escorting Napoleon's carriage. After the conclusion of an armistice signed by the French, Russian, and Prussian commissioners, Monsieur de Metternich arrived in Dresden. On the 28th of June, he had that famous interview with Napoleon in which, casting off the mask, he demanded, as the price of Austria's fidelity to the French alliance, the cession of Illyria and half of Italy, the renunciation of the protectorate of the Confederation of the Rhine, the abandonment of Holland and of Spain, of the Swiss mediation, and that of the Duchy of Warsaw. The answer which the emperor made in an outburst of just indignation which he could not control in the face of so arrogant an expression of wishes is well known. Ah, Metternich, how much has England paid you to make me such proposals? The explanation of this language was indeed soon arrived at by the news of the convention which Monsieur de Starion, the Austrian minister, had signed on June 27th, the day before Metternich's audience with Napoleon, a covenant by virtue of which the Allies accepted the offer of the mediation of the cabinet of Vienna and settled the conditions which should be imposed on France. These conditions were still more implicitly determined by the Treaty of Schreckenberg, stated the 9th July following, which laid down the plan of the military operations of the campaign and the distribution of the subsidies supplied by England to the coalition. Austria and Sweden were the contracting parties in this treaty and united their contingents to the Russian and Prussian forces. After the preceding explanations, it would be of little interest to investigate at what period the Austrian cabinet commenced negotiations with the Allied cabinets. Various indications would suggest that this took place as far back as the time when Prince Schwarzenberg was sent to Paris bearing professions of friendship and fidelity to the French alliance. It was, as the reader has seen, just at the time of Napoleon's departure for the army. Bad faith could not be carried any further. Whilst awaiting the opening of the Congress, which was to be held at Prague, and the end of the negotiations with the object of prolonging a truce, Napoleon could no longer have any doubt about the understanding come to by Austria, and the alliance left for Mayence. He wanted to spend some days there to give orders for various arrangements which he considered necessary for the truest interests of the empire in case of resumption of hostilities. He had asked the Empress to come and meet him there in a letter in which he mentioned the names of the persons who were to accompany her. I was mentioned by name. At the same time as he wrote to the Empress, he addressed a letter to the Arch-Chancellor on the same subject. He even took the precaution to send an article which was to be published in the Moniteur to announce his journey. The Empress left St. Cloud on July 23rd at 6 o'clock in the morning. She slept at Chalon and Metz, received the principal authorities there, and arrived at Mayence on the 25th at 3 o'clock in the morning in very bad weather. She was afraid that the emperor might have got there before her, but he only arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening of the same day. Napoleon was in good health. His complexion was heightened and bronzed by the air of the camps. It was with real pleasure that I saw the emperor again, and he received me very kindly. I once more attended him as secretary until the arrival of his cabinet, and was entrusted with numerous commissions by him. It pleased me to find myself once more living in this familiar and confidential manner with him, and I witnessed Napoleon's departure with sorrow. My heart was oppressed as I took leave of him, for I was worried with Austria's suspicious conduct and the doubtful issue of the Congress of Prague. During his stay at Mayence, the emperor lived in a very retired manner, very busy in his cabinet with military and diplomatic correspondence, working with his ministers in turn, but especially with the Minister of Finance on matters of inner administration, and also in view of the uncertain duration of the struggle, which was about to begin. The princes adjoining the Confederation of the Rhine, amongst others, the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess of Baden, the Prince Primate, the Prince of Nassau, and Grand Duke of Hesse-Darmstadt, took advantage of the Emperor's statements to come and pay him court. The beauty of the weather, which had become quite serene, again enabled the Empress to drive out every day in an open carriage. Her court had been increased by the arrival of the Princess de Wagram, who had come with her children to Mayence to see her husband. Berthier. The Countess of Lobau was impatiently expected there by her husband, who was very much upset by the delay in her arrival. When she at last arrived, it was on the day before that fixed for Napoleon's departure. During a stay at Mayence, the Empress, who wished to give the Emperor a present on his name day, which was approaching, commissioned Isabelle, who was taking the waters at Vichy, to paint the portrait of herself and her son in a group on a snuff box. Napoleon left Mayence on August 1st at 6 in the evening to return to Dresden and arrived there at 9 o'clock in the morning of the 4th. It was from this city that issued a decree which has been styled an act of excessive arbitrariness. At the time of Napoleon's journey to Holland in the autumn of 1812, he had heard at Antwerp that the mayor and the directors of customs were charged with fraud, having caused a loss of over 2 millions to the city, this sum having been divided among the embezzlers. The emperor had issued a decree at Flushing, which sent the individuals who were accused of having embezzled this money to be tried at the Court of Sessions to be held at Brussels. A very long trial ensued, which ended in the accused being acquitted on the dishonest verdict of a jury, which had probably been won over to the side of the embezzlers in advance. As was to be expected, this verdict produced a great scandal. Napoleon, who had the reports of his inspectors of finance, knew that the receiver of customs directed by the mayor and by the head of the department at the prefecture had double sets of books for registering the receipts from the customs and would not allow such a swindle to remain unpunished, and of his own authority suspended the verdict which acquitted the cheats. At the same time, he commissioned the Court of Cassation to designate another tribunal before which the trial should be commenced. This decision was without any doubt a blow to the independence of the jury, but corruption triumphing. Morality was, on the other hand, outraged, and the conscience of the sovereign, in whose name justice was rendered, was charged with an obviously iniquitous judgment. In this state of things, was the embezzlement of public money to be encouraged with immunity, or was the insufficiency of the law to be remedied by an act of vigor? Napoleon could not be expected to accept the responsibility of a decision which was calculated to injure public morality, and this proves his vigilance for the interests of the citizens, even in the midst of the cares of war. At the same time, the harbor basin of Cherbourg was finished, and the letting in of the sea into this basin was an important event. The emperor pressed his wish to the empress that she should be present at this inauguration in order to add to its solemnity. It was in consequence decided that Marie-Louise should proceed to Cherbourg on her return to Paris. I give below the letter which Napoleon wrote on this subject to the Arch-Chancellor when he had returned to Dresden. The letters which I gave above and the following one will suffice to show the reach of the emperor's foresight and to what minute details he could descend. My cousin, I shall be pleased that the empress should go to Cherbourg. First of all, to enjoy the beautiful sight of the sea being let into the basin. And secondly, to invest this operation with solemnity. The Minister of Marine can precede the Empress to Cherbourg to prepare her reception and the best means of amusing her during her stay. The Empress will leave on the 17th or the 18th, and the operation can take place on her name day. The principal authorities of the department will be present, and so interesting a spectacle will not fail to attract an immense crowd of sightseers. Insert all the particulars of the Empress's journey and return to Mayence in the papers. And hereupon, I pray God, etc., signed Napoleon. Dresden, the 7th of August, 1813.